Thank you. Okay. So I think now that we've discussed a little bit the impacts natural disasters can have and do have on human rights, I think it'd be good now to address the relationship between all the NGOs that you're referring to and the business community, and you know, what their relationship is. So I guess this is directed both at you, Mr. Cruz, and you, Mr. Ballesteros in particular. What exactly is the relationship between like businesses and other, you know, NGO aid providers?
I can start and give the point of view of global giving and the work that we do and how we work with businesses and with corporations. And I know that in that way we're really unique. So it'd also be great to hear from other panelists as to you know, the other variations that take place. So for us, we work with corporations in a number of different ways. I would say that about half of the volume of the donations that we receive of the grants for disaster response, about half of that comes from corporations and the other half from individual donors. And so we have a team that manages the relationships with our corporate donors, and they work really closely with us on the crisis response in order to help to formulate targeted corporate giving strategies. And so I can highlight a couple of the ways that we do that. So on the one hand, we help to administer and to run grant programs for certain corporations. So they entrust us, they know that we vet and we verify all of the nonprofit partners that we work with. So that could be one iteration. The other might be that the corporation has potentially an outpost, has a facility in country, and they have employees, and they have in mind organizations that they would like to give to. And so they ask us to perform our due diligence, our vetting process, because they want to ensure that that organization is in good standing. And we also look at the board of directors and the senior staff. And so we will do that on their behalf, also looking at the financial in the absorptive capacity. The other might be that we might help to feed our API. So basically allowing organizations who maybe have their own platforms for employee giving. So they want employee engagement. Their employees have asked, you know, how can we give and how can we give directly to this? But they already have their own platform. And so they will pull in directly and they can like constantly kind of do this like technical ping, if you will, of all of our projects that are tagged for that particular disaster. We also give employee giving cards. And so again, like that, corporations, employees can give directly.
It is interesting, right? Because the business sector has been involved in philanthropic giving in the aftermath of disasters for centuries, right? So there are reports of that. But really in the last 20 years, there has been a rapid increase in the participation of business organizations. And that responds to several things. One, for instance, is the reduction of the traditional scheme of international aid. So this is comprised by multilateral agencies and foreign governments. So given this, there has been also an increase in the internationalization of the supply chain. So as Sandrine was mentioning, if you have more corporations, and I emphasize corporations, meaning organizations that have offices and branches in different countries, this is going to affect the operation of the company, and is going to increase the incentives of the corporation to donate, either because the market has been affected and that reduces the income for the corporation itself, or it has been directly hit by the disaster, or because their employees, for instance, are victims themselves. So there are different factors, but what is true is that in this period, if you compare the relative participation of the business corporation versus the participation of other actors, foreign governments, multilaterals, NGOs, there's no other entity that has had a larger increase in participation.
my question was then, so you both talked about how businesses like can be a good actor. So what then would you describe would be like the best practice of a business operation in terms of giving aid after natural disasters?
That's still an empirical question, right? So we don't have the right answer for that. So what we developed with the study with Michael Yusim and Tyler Wright from the Wharton School is initially understanding of the answer to this question, right? So what we found is that two things. When you hold everything constant, the best that we could do in terms of the characteristics of the disaster, the characteristics of the actors providing aid, the characteristics of the country, the characteristics of the business organization. If you increase the level of participation of business organizations that have operations in the affected country, the country is going to recover faster. And we measure this with the Human Development Index across 10 years after the disaster. So in other words, if we have more business organizations that have operations in the affected country donating to the disaster in comparison with other entities, the country has recovered faster. And we use the past 20 years to measure this. And the second thing that we observe is that given this group, the organizations that operate in the affected country, donating, when you consider the type of donation, surprisingly, based on what we have discussed so far, is that we found that when there's in-kind donation, and these tend to be substantial, the recovery of the affected country is going to be faster. So when you have a corporation donating that has local operations and donates in kind, the country recovers faster.
I would bring up again that a challenge area and certainly a space that we're looking to explore is what this looks like again for complex emergencies, right, where we know that a lot of companies are likely not operating because there's just not that kind of safe environment for them to be able to do so. And here I'm thinking of the Yemens of the world or South Sudan and the like. An example of a corporate partnership that we have, and this started in November, that I want to highlight, which is it's another side of this discussion. We're again looking to have intermediaries. So I do think that there's a lot of space for companies to give directly, and particularly where they already have a presence and where they may already have production or what have you. But I think sometimes it becomes really difficult to pivot to doing response. And so I think it's important to have and establish relationships with the local government and local communities, where that corporation or those corporations who want to do good in that space, but maybe don't already have those established connections. And I think that's where organizations like ours can help put them in contact with those local organizations, not necessarily local actors or government actors, because we don't work with them. But I would want to highlight this crisis response partnership that we have with Facebook. So this is a space that they've really been looking to expand, and they have a social good team that is certainly increasing. And so we now partner, so we power their crisis donate button, which is featured on their crisis response pages for mainly natural disasters, so nothing that is linked to acts of violence. And so we then are responsible for taking the funds and for responsibly partnering with our vetted partners in those affected areas. And so that's another way. And I mean, I'm highlighting global giving. That's who I'm representing, and I think that we do really well in this space. But there's also other room to find ways to link up, I guess, corporations and especially employees of those corporations who want to do good, who want to invest more resources, and may not necessarily be able to connect right away with all of these really great local groups or even with NGOs at times, just because there isn't that sort of capacity to be able to both manage that relationship and then also to focus on the response. And so I think that there's a lot of room for improvement there as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I think now to bring it on to the main point of this discussion is then what steps is to talk about then the intersection of business, disaster aid, and human rights and where to improve. And I think the first and most important question is what steps can aid providers, corporate and what steps can these aid providers take to ensure the protection of human rights?
It's important to be part of discussions, and there are some, civil military, for instance, coordination in the aftermath of disasters, is one such forum, and, bringing together military actors, humanitarian actors, and then having sort of corollary, platforms for businesses as well. And there are some, it's just that I think we need to have more of that so that when we, sit around the table and we have these discussions, it doesn't come across as though the way that we humanitarians talk sometimes makes it seem like, we're the ones with the principles and then the businesses just, want to do whatever, it's like this bull in the china shop kind of thing. And so really, taking advantage of blue sky situations where we can come together and we can, establish relationships already, and we can, learn the language. We all have, our own vernacular, and so learning more about, how it is that humanitarians operate and how businesses do as well, and having a greater understanding of that, I think goes a long way. It is true that, these different coordination mechanisms, they just take up a lot of time, and I think, we all have our different notions and perceptions of what these other sets of actors are and stand for. And I think that, businesses knowing that this is how a lot of these, UN-led corporation mechanisms just end up being a lot of talk and little action sometimes, that doesn't help, move things along.
I think for business managers, it's important to understand how to answer the trust question that they normally have, because there are places where institutions are really weak, and even though they have operations, they never going to develop the same expertise as local organizations, civilian organizations, and that is not their work, right? But what we have seen in the last 5 years, especially, is several companies that have been invested in developing units that are completely dedicated to disaster relief, like Coca-Cola, Walmart. Those are two of the major corporations that are acting in this sense, and they are also trying to develop this local understanding, which means a lot of work, right? And it's an investment that is not trivial because it entails understanding the different stakeholders in the community, and also the stakeholders that are normally outside the community, but they are present in the aftermath of a disaster. But one thing that we have found after our interviews with managers is that they have had trust issues in the past with different disasters. And what we had heard regarding the donations in the aftermath of major disasters, not only in the developing world, but also here in the US, for instance. We have all these scandals related with Hurricane Katrina of nonprofit organizations that use the resources that were donated from the public for other areas, right? So corruption is not only coming from the normal actors that the manager is used to. So if they cannot trust the local NPO. They are going to try to develop the resources to reach the victims for those companies that actually have the resources to do that, right? In the worst case scenario, they are going to stop donating to disasters because logistical difficulties related with that, right?
If I could jump in and pick up on something Luis said, I think it's really important to look at the question of the capacity of the local government. When you've got a strong local government, you know, they can set criteria. And remember the Indonesian government after the 2004 tsunami, you know, setting very strict criteria on the kind of houses that could be built. It's really very helpful to everyone when you have a strong government. When you don't, or when the government's capacity is really limited, then I think you see a different role for the private sector, a different role for humanitarian organizations. After Hurricane Katrina, I mean, it was Walmart and Home Depot and Lowe's were able to move in water and building supplies when FEMA seemed paralyzed. You know, and so I think that, you know, in that respect, the private sector and humanitarian organizations can sometimes fill the gap when the government doesn't have the capacity. But it's usually better all around when the government is strong and keeping track of things and figuring out who's doing good work and giving some guidance to everyone in terms of where certain kinds of investment or assistance is needed and where it may not be.
I think a follow-up question I'd like to ask them for the group is, you keep talking about cooperation, but do you have any kind of like more mechanized, in-depth, so like ideas when you say you would like more cooperation in order to like do XYZ plan in regards to everything you just?
On the traditional humanitarian side, and the main structure for coordination are these clusters, where there are certain designated clusters with lead agencies that meet, and you know they have really mixed records. Some function well, some are really bureaucratic. They should be functioning at the country level. You know, I wonder if there isn't some way that there could be an engagement of the private sector in the clusters, if not sitting through all of these meetings, some kind of a liaison, so that when a cluster, for example, identifies a particular health need in region X, or, you know, we've got a real problem with trash collection in region Y, that somehow that could be communicated to, you know, private enterprises that are looking for a way to get involved. You may come across a corporation that has particular expertise in one of these areas where there's an urgent need, and knowing about the possibility of what's needed and what's available might make for more fluid cooperation. But what Sandrina was saying about the importance of establishing those relationships before the disaster, you know, when people know each other, it's really easy to pick up the phone and say, hey, can you help us out here, one way or the other, or in either direction. But when you don't know anybody, I mean, things get really tense and move very fast after a disaster. It becomes a little bit more stilted, more difficult. So I would really encourage building the relationships beforehand.
I guess if I could add as well is that there is this sometimes unfortunate competition among NGOs. And so, you know, if they have relationships with certain corporations, you know, it's, it doesn't always lend itself to you know, collaborate nicely, and I think that you know, it's not pervasive, but it's definitely more common than I think it should be. And actually, what led me to think about that was what Dr. Ferris was saying about potential inclusion of corporations in these cluster meetings. And I know that it's something that occurs in some countries where you have some funders present, but they'll tend to be, you know, institutional donors. And I know that that's already a bit of a contested space, so I don't know what that could look like. But I think that if we could help to diffuse some of that competition, I think that that would go a long way, and then potentially open up, you know, the avenue to being able to have, you know, to the extent that there's a corporate partner at the table. I think that they are curious. I think that they do want to be involved, and you know, it might set up a whole new mechanism for accountability. So, you know, and along those lines, and I know I keep beating on this drum, but also, you know, incorporate more local organizations. And some of the difficulties that I've heard from local organizations trying to kind of break through that and attend these meetings is that, you know, they are very bureaucratic, you know, they kind of have their own lingo, and, you know, they take up a lot of time, and, you know, these are severely under-resourced organizations, and, you know, sometimes just even trying to navigate through the parlance is difficult and challenging. So how do we maybe democratize that process a bit more?